Testing. We're good. Well, good morning to each of you. We do have some handouts coming around. Hopefully get those to everybody that can use one. We are in Joshua chapter 10 this morning. Let's see. I have given you at the top of the front page of your handout and now my clicker's not working either. Matt, can you advance a slide for me? Or Becca? Oh, okay. Good enough. There it is. Now it'll probably go 3 or 4, catching up with my clicks, right? No, I think that was Becca. Thank you, Becca. If you've been with us from the start of the book, you've seen this before. It's a layout, outline form kind of the book. And I just wanted to point out to you where we're at on that. It's the highlighted section there, or on your handout, it's got a red square around it. Chapter 10, along with 11 and 12, give us the conquest of the land. Chapter 10, which will begin today, is the initial run through the southern part, what eventually became Judah. Chapter 10, I don't think, to me this wasn't intuitive the first time I read through it. But I'm quite convinced now that it actually gives us the same story twice. The first time, verses 1 through 15, which we'll look at this morning, which ends up with they return to the camp at Gilgal. The second section, which is 16 to 30 whatever, ends the same way and covers essentially the same material. So I don't think they made 2 trips up into the south to conquer, but it's a retelling of the same thing. We'll come back to that when we get down to verse 15. So this is important because, well, for a couple of reasons. One of which is this is the beginning of the actual fulfillment on a large scale of God giving the Israelites the land, which is the point of the whole book. God brings his people into the promised land and gives it to them. Now, he's already given them a couple of cities, Jericho, Ai. They've been up to Shechem to renew the covenant. But this is the initiation of a large-scale giving of the land to the Israelites by God. I think it's running. We're back up. Sweet. Thank you. I can actually see what I'm doing now. Technology. It works all week long, and then Sunday morning, 5 minutes before you want to start, it dies. Okay. If you were with us for the last couple lessons, we saw that the Israelites were duped into making a covenant with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites lived in Gibeon, which was smack dab in the center of the land that God was giving to the Israelites. They made a covenant with them, and the details of the covenant are not given, but one of the first things we'll see here is that the Gibeonites are attacked by their countrymen and call on Israel for help, and the Israelites respond. That tells me that one of the aspects of this covenant between the two was mutual aid. We're not ever given that in the text. It doesn't list the stipulations of their covenant. But apparently, one part of it, and it would be a very common thing in this day, was mutual aid. Somebody attacks us, you'll help us. Somebody attacks you, we'll help you. Okay. Chapter 10, and let's begin reading here in verse 1. Joshua chapter 10, verse 1. Now it came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore, Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, to Piram, king of Yarmouth, to, sorry, I'm going to struggle here, Japhia. You okay if I say Japhia? Because Hebrew doesn't have a J. So, to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, the king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel." So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmouth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon and fought against it. This is the area of ancient Jerusalem. Interesting side note, this is the first time in the Old Testament where it is described by that name, Jerusalem. We have earlier references to the same city, but called by different names, such as Salem or Jebus. But if I took the time, we could go to a number of different passages that would tell us Salem, which is Jerusalem, or Jebus, which is Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, which is the city of David, things like that. This is the first appearance of the full-blown name. And this is an aerial photo of the area roughly that was Jebus, Jerusalem, at that time, at the time of Joshua. You can see the old city walls up above it. Those were built even post-Crusader, and the original city is not even within the old city walls, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of on a ridge, and I've got a little arrow there pointing to the Gihon Spring, which was its water source. And they had that spring heavily fortified. I'm not going to go through and show you pictures of these other cities, but I will show you a map. So Jerusalem, well, okay, Gibeon is up at the top. Jerusalem is a little further south. And the other 4 cities are south of Jerusalem and a little bit off to the west in the main. Hebron is directly south, or most directly south of Jerusalem. And there are a couple of other names that we'll run into here as we move through the text that are also listed on there. But the ones on this map with the boxes around them, and you can see I've got a different map on your handout, but the same places. They're all connected by the green arrows on your map. The king of Jerusalem, his name, Adoni-Zedek. Anybody know or want to hazard a guess at what that means? Yeah, you would recognize Adonai or Adoni as Lord, Master, or something like that. Actually, my master. Zedek is righteous or righteousness. So his name means something like, my Lord, my master is righteous, or is righteousness. It's a little hard to tell. Does that remind you of another king of this same city from an earlier period? Yes, Melchizedek. Melchizedek. Melchi is my king, and then Zedek. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? I mean, they're hundreds of years apart, but they both got this righteousness thing on the end of their name. I don't know what to do with that other than point it out, but it's like, coincidence? I don't know. Melchizedek was a believer, a follower of Yahweh, the true God. This guy is not, but maybe a descendant of the same guy. I don't know. It's interesting. Okay. He's afraid, and the reason is because the Israelites have not captured a small city like Ai, or even Jericho, secluded, no neighbors around. But now they've made a pact with Gibeon. Gibeon has gone over to their side. In a sense, Gibeon is now Israelite territory. And Gibeon is a large city, like one of the royal cities. And you'll notice when the Gibeonites came down to the Israelites, there's no mention of a king, just kind of the elders and everything. But with these other cities, Jerusalem, Yarmouth, Lachish, Hebron, each one of them has a king, right? And so Gibeon was right on the edge of having its own king. So it was a good size. This is not a little village somewhere. And of course, we read earlier too that it had daughter cities around it. So this is an impressive city. And the fact that it has gone over to the side of Israel is frightening to the rest of the people, the Canaanites or Amorites as they're called here, living in the land. I know some of you are wondering, so I'll just say the rest of these guys that are mentioned here never appear anywhere else in the Old Testament, and we don't know of any of them from extra-biblical sources either. About 50 years after Joshua, we have a collection of letters that were written like from guys at Lachish and Hebron and Jerusalem to Egyptians. And so we know the name of some of the kings about 50 years after the time of Joshua. Abdi-Hepa was the king of Jerusalem. A guy by the name of Zimreda was the king of Lachish. But again, that's a little later than this time period. So we don't know of any of these guys from any other source, and they're not mentioned again in the Hebrew Bible either. So they come up and surround the city as preparation to attack it, and hopefully, as part of the siege, actually take it. Gibeonites in verse 6 then, Joshua 10 and verse 6, the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. How would you like to be the guy responsible for taking that message? You see these armies coming in and surrounding the city. Somebody's got to break through, get out. I probably would have tried to go at night and sneak out between guards or something, but somebody's got to make it down to Gilgal, down to Jericho, to call for help. And somebody did that. This call, by the way, is a test of the treaty between Israel and the Gibeonites. Are you going to honor your word? It's kind of a significant thing. They got skin in the game now. If they come up and help Gibeon, they run the risk of losing people in battle. This could actually hurt. So it's a fairly significant test. And it's one that Joshua and the elders pass. They have a responsibility here, and they step up to the plate. Verses 7 and 8. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. I would love to know just a little bit more here. When these guys made a covenant with the Gibeonites, they didn't ask for God's input. The text specifically points that out, which was a big mistake. Here, the text never says, did they inquire of God or not. It just says they got ready to go up and help, which would have been the fulfillment of their covenant obligation. And it tells us that God approved. Whether they asked or not, it doesn't say. Maybe we can assume that they did. But either way, God says, yeah, this is the right thing to do, and I'm on your side, and these guys, you'll be able to defeat them. Well, actually, it's God that defeats them in a pretty impressive way if you read ahead at all.
These enemies that are attacking the Gibeonites, they're ultimately going to be enemies of Israel anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the land that God has given them. So by attacking them and protecting the Gibeonites for their contract, they're also defeating or taking the land.
Yeah, taking the land that God has promised. Yeah.
It's sort of it isn't attacking them individually at the time. It's saying, okay, battle's already here.
Yeah, the battle has come to us, but it's one that we were expecting to fight anyway, really. Yeah, and it's fascinating to me that these other kings, cities, kingdoms, they have a choice. We've heard from a number of Canaanites already. We heard how God led you out of Egypt, the miracle, the crossing of the Red Sea. You've taken the eastern lands across the Jordan. We've heard this, and we know God is giving you this land, and we're afraid. We've heard that from a few different folks. So I would assume these guys the same thing. They've also heard, so what are you going to do? You could walk away. There are people that do that, sometimes chased out of other areas, but there are migrations that take place. Well, trickery, but that one's already been tried, and I doubt if that one would work again. Or fight. Take it to them. And unfortunately for these guys, that's the decision that they make. We're going to go fight against Israel. Obviously, they're not believers in the Israelite God, so you wouldn't expect them to be obedient to him either. But they did have a choice. They could have left. They could have walked away and said, we're so freaked out, you guys just take the land, we're going somewhere else. But they made a different decision, and it'll cost them dearly. Okay. Verse 9, Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. Here's an aerial photo of Gibeon, where this siege was taking place. We're looking north, by the way, for you guys. So the Amorites are coming up from the south, from the area of Jerusalem. And the Israelites in the blue line there are coming up from Gilgal. And by the way, you can see Ai off in the distance. That's not too far from the city of Gibeon. And then the Israelites are going to chase these Amorites off to the northwest. You know, where identifies the Beit Horon Ridge there. We'll look at a little bit of that. By marching all night. Verse 10, and the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, this is God, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beit Horon, which, by the way, it's the ascent of Beit Horon, but they are descending it. Okay, they're going down it. I see that hand.
One of my commentaries had a note that, like, from Gilgal to Gibeon was a steep climb. It's hard to tell in that shot too. Is that?
Yeah. So Gibeon is kind of on the western side of the central Benjamin Plateau. So once they get up on the plateau, it's relatively flat. But that climb, because Gilgal, Jericho, is hundreds of feet below sea level, and this is hundreds, 700-800 feet above sea level. So yes, there was a steep climb involved in this. But yeah, right at the end here, I mean, you're only looking at the last couple miles, and it's a lot flatter there because they have arrived on top of the plateau. Let's see. So they, while I was in 10, God pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beit Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. You can see this on your map, on your handout. It's the purple line with the little red arrows going out, showing people are trying to get away. They're fleeing. From Gibeon all the way down to Makkedah, which is at the very end of the purple arrows, that is close to 40 miles. So somebody is really hoofing it here. I think in my present condition, I would have been one of the guys that you either hide or you just give up and you're like, okay, stick me now, because I'm beat. Some of these guys were in better condition than me and ran a long way. And as we'll see, while God was pelting them, so God actually pelts them, bombards them from Beit Horon to Azekah, and that's about 20 miles or so. So let's read that. Verse 11. It came about as they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beit Horon, that the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those who the sons of Israel killed with the sword. I told you earlier, it's actually not going to be the Israelites that win this. It's God that does it for them in a most astounding way. We have here in verse 11 two different words that are used. In your English, you probably got stones and then hailstones. Stones is kind of a generic word, and there are different words in Hebrew as well. But the second word, hailstones, actually narrows that down and identifies it as a specific kind of thing. It's the same word that's used in, oh boy, I forgot which number of plague it was in Egypt when God sent hailstones, and he told the Israelites ahead of time, bring your livestock in and bring your people in, your servants, because anybody that stays out is apt to die from these massive hailstones. It's the same word that's used here. Let me just run you quickly a couple of aerial photos down this descent. It's still a route that's followed by the modern highway, more or less, because the land is fitting for an ascent up through the hills. This is the lower end of it. So it was a well-known road, or you might call it a path at the time, route. And so the Amorites take off down this thing. The Israelites must have come around on the south side to prevent them from just going back to Jerusalem. And so they take off to the northwest, travel down this route. You can see the two different cities there, Upper and Lower Beit Horon. And then once they get out onto the flat, they pass by the eastern end of the Ajalon Valley and are heading south toward Azekah. This is a land view. Some dude standing on the ground, pointing his camera down this path, toward looking west toward the sea. And you can see the modern highway there that follows the same route. During the Roman period, the Romans cut some steps to help people get up and down some of the steeper parts of this pass. So here we've turned around. This is an aerial photo, but it's looking off kind of toward the northwest. And this one is looking off toward the south. The city of Beit Shemesh right there in the foreground, where the Philistines sent the Ark of the Covenant back home to the Israelites. And then there's just kind of a valley that you can follow all the way down to Azekah, which is this little mound right here. And of course they kept fleeing, but the hailstones were thrown on them for the entirety of that route. Let's see, rather than take you all the way down to Makkedah, I'm going to show you a picture of a hailstone. This is a record setter out of South Dakota. That's bigger than softball size, right? You've seen some of the damage that good-sized hail can do, breaking out car windows. Have you ever tried to break out a car window with a hammer or something, or a baseball bat? They're tough. And yet you get good-sized hail, and it can actually punch through those. I'm not familiar with stories of people actually getting killed by hailstones. I know it's happened. But you can only imagine if you happen to be out when this kind of stuff is falling. The one I gave you on your handout is another good size. I'd call that about softball size, maybe a little bigger. Yeah. We don't usually see this kind of thing, and they don't usually either. This is a very, very unusual kind of hail. And it almost sounds like, I mean, maybe they wouldn't have to be, but it almost sounds like God is directing them, taking out people right and left. And I just can't imagine a 20-mile run with this kind of stuff coming down. I mean, if you didn't have the fear of God in you before, you should by this point. And so God not only approves their plan to go up and defend Gibeon, God fights on their behalf and does it in a miraculous, unnatural way. These things killed more than the Israelites killed with the sword. The Israelites just kind of follow along the backside of this thing and do mop-up. You know? Somebody that's gotten whacked and broken back and can't move, some mighty warrior, okay, we'll finish him off. But it sounds like there's not a whole lot else to do for these Israelites. God is going before them and just decimating these Amorites who decided that they would fight against God. And then maybe the most astounding part of this whole account, I know the hail is already, but look in verse 12. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Wow. And there was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Gary and I were discussing this earlier in the week. I'd like to read the occasional commentary on this kind of stuff and just like, am I missing something? You guys have some other information here. And so this guy, he's a pretty good commentator, conservative, and you know I would recommend him. I appreciate a lot of what he has to say. He gave probably 5 or 6 different ways that this has been interpreted, and of course that spans the spectrum. And the way he ended up, I was pretty disappointed in this, was, well, it's poetry, Okay, grant that. I mean, you can probably see in your English text that it's kind of laid out as in poetic lines. And in Hebrew, it's quite clearly poetry, the length of the line and the brevity. And he says we've got other places where, the stars shout for joy or other celestial things happen, and it's just imagery. It's not to be taken as literal. I'm like, did you read the rest of the verse? The sun didn't go down for about a whole day. How is that just imagery? And the author here is clearly astounded by what took place. And I don't see any reason to take it other than as a literal, and this is hard for us to fathom until you remember that God created the sun and the moon and the earth and got them moving at precisely the right distance, the right speed. I mean, everything, it's like unbelievably precise the way our solar system works. That same God stopped him. Said, hey, we're gonna give Joshua time to do his mop up, right? It's unfathomable to me that anybody but God could do that. But for him who created it, I'm like, there's no issue. He made it, he can stop it, he can start it, whatever he wants.
All the parts of it.
All the parts of it, yeah. I don't understand, I mean, to me, clearly, if you by some mechanism could stop the earth, I mean, we'd all go, because we still got momentum, we'd all go flying in some direction. The earth is moving about 1,000 miles an hour, the surface as it rotates. Whoa, and that didn't happen here. But the God who can stop the earth can also stop the stuff on the earth, right? He states here that the sun, let me actually read that again. The sun's in verse 13. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Now, that would be easy for us to track today. Pull out your phone, it's noon, the sun's up there. Wow, it's telling me it's 12 a.m. now, midnight, and the sun's still up there. Okay, we can keep track of that pretty easy. How would the ancients have done it? How would they know the sun stopped for about a whole day? How would they know the sun stopped at all?
Sundial.
A sundial? Okay. The shadow on a sundial moves pretty slow.
Sand.
Okay, sand going through a sundial. Well, this is another one Gary and I talked about. We have activities, daily activities, that we know about how long it takes, right? I'm going to drive out to Denver today. Well, if I leave here at noon, at this time of year, I know it's going to about be sunset, about dark by the time I get out there, right? I don't even think about it really, but if I left here at noon and I got out there and the sun was still at the same place, I'd be like, there's something weird going on here. If you're a farmer, you know about how many acres you can till in an afternoon or in a day. So you get done with that much. Wait a minute. It's supposed to be evening. I got all that done, and I still got half the day left. So you can imagine there are a few different ways where people could be like, oh, isn't it bedtime yet? The sun is still up. And of course, on the other side of the earth, they get a long, long night. But again, the same thing. If you've ever tended a fire all night, you got to keep feeding it. And if you've done it enough, you know about how much wood it takes to get through the night. And now all of a sudden, I've already fed it, and I fed it again, and it's still pitch dark. Feed it again. So there are some ways in which, because I've wondered, how do people down in the other major areas down in Egypt, over in Mesopotamia, those guys watch the sun and the stars and the moon all the time. They recorded it. And they see this phenomenon happen. They took note. You know they did. What do you do with it? Something's going on somewhere. What an amazing thing. See a question there.
In Alaska, we got to see it every summer, and the tourists would get so confused. We just had to laugh at them, and they would have dinner. And 8 hours later, they'd be like, "It's not bedtime yet." I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's 2 in the morning."
It's still like, you need to go to bed. It's 2 in the morning. Yeah. Yeah. Did you catch what the author actually marvels at? Yeah. Never another day like it when the solar system stopped. No, that's not what he says. When God listened to the voice of a man. Isn't that amazing? Joshua said, "O sun, stop. O moon, stop." And he names where they're supposed to stop. Well, it wasn't Joshua's power or ability. It was God listening to Joshua and saying, "Okay, I'll do what you asked." Now, that's not to discount in any way, because I think another one of the astounding things here is actually what God did. And there are many places. This is not the only time when God listened to the voice of a man either. In fact, we're encouraged so many times to pray, and that God hears to us and God responds to us, and I think that's part of our takeaway here. But here, God obeyed a man who asked for something outrageous. In Hebrew, listen to and obey is essentially the same word. Don't take me wrong when I use the word obey. God is not at our beck and call. And yet here, he did in a way that was just absolutely astounding. I don't know if you picked up that both sun and moon were visible. And if you like to watch the moon, you know that's a fairly common thing. During daylight, you kind of have to be looking for it or know where to look, but this is one of the old city walls in Jerusalem with the moon, half moon out there over during the middle of the day, which happens.
So this person has only lived for, 50 years or whatever, so from his standpoint, he would think that there's never been another day like it. As opposed to somebody that lived for a million years, he'd have a different view of it. So this man is in awe of the thing that God has done here.
Yeah.
Therefore, from his perspective, he's saying there's never been anything else like it.
Yeah, from his perspective. It is interesting. When you think of some of the other really major miracles that God did for the Israelites, crossing the Red Sea, but pause just a second. Was that in response to Moses' request or command? No. God said, "Hold out your staff, dude. I'm going to do something here." It wasn't a human initiative. And there's a number of other very miraculous things like that. But I think this one is a little unique in being a really super miraculous thing, but that was initiated by a man. You familiar with what James says about prayer?
You have not because you ask not.
Okay. And he names a specific person.
Righteous.
Okay, a righteous man, but he names a character out of the Old Testament. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. And he prayed that it would not rain, and it did not rain for 3 years. And he prayed again, and it rained. And the earth brought forth its produce. What's your point, James? He was a man with a nature like ours. And God listened to him. That one is a fascinating one because if you go back and read in Kings, Elijah just appears before Ahab and says it's not going to rain. It doesn't give us any detail on interaction with God or that kind of stuff. But James fills that in for us and says, he prayed and it didn't rain, which is another astounding miracle. Very quickly then, verse 15. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. And if you flip over to the last verse of the chapter, verse 43, you get the same thing. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. So I think he's just, for this little part, he's bringing us to the end. And then in verse 16, he will retell part of this and fill in some other details that we didn't have, as opposed to 2 trips up into the land. And we have other cases like that. An obvious one is Genesis 1 and 2, where we get a little more of an overview how God created the earth and man is part of that. And then he comes back and says, now, here's how it happened, and gives us more detail. The man was all by himself. He named the animals. Then God said, I'm going to create a woman. All that happened in the first chapter, but we get the detail in the second chapter. Retelling isn't quite the right word, but you understand what I'm saying. And I think that's what's going on here too. A few points to ponder. God honors those who honor him and who keep their promises. We saw that early on. Joshua said, you guys call for help. We have a covenant with you. Okay, it may cost us, but we'll come to your aid. And we see that God honored that and was with him in that. I think a major point here is that God is the master over what he has created. No other explanation for the description here of the sun and moon stopping for about a whole day. God still has control over that stuff and can do with it as he pleases. And we see that happen there. And God is attentive to the prayer of the righteous. Sounds a whole lot like James there. Last slide here. I just wanted to read to you on a related note some of Jesus' words out of Matthew 7. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be opened. Or what man is there among you, when his son shall ask him for a loaf, will he give him a stone? Or if he shall ask for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? I think that's an important takeaway from this chapter, this section. God honors requests. He's listening to us. You have a need? Ask him. Yeah, there are qualifications. If you ask because of lust in your heart or selfishness or those kinds of things, don't count on him fulfilling those requests. But God is attentive. He cares about his children. Don't be afraid to ask. He listens, and I think we see that in a marvelous way here, an unusual way. But God listens to all of his children, and like Jesus said, he'll give what is good to his own children, to those who ask. I need to quit. Good, there's no hands. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for this narrative here. We're encouraged by the way that you take care of your people. We know that we as your children can also count on you to take care of us. Help us to grow in our faith. We see Joshua exercising his faith and asking you to do something astounding here, and you did it. And we marvel at that and yet are encouraged by it too. Pray that you would strengthen us in our faith, help us to be obedient to you, and help us also to have the courage to ask you for the things that we need. We know that you love us and respond to us, and help us to rest in that. In your name I pray. Amen.